All right, Alexander, let's talk about the state of the UK economy. As Starmer is playing make-believe Churchill in Paris, talking about how the UK is going to defeat Russia and how the UK military is going to enter Ukraine. We have a terrible situation that is happening in the UK with regards to the economy. Starmer doesn't seem to be paying much attention to what is happening in the economy, but things are getting very bad. What is the situation in the UK?
I have never known a prime minister who has spent so little time on domestic and economic questions as Keir Starmer does. Before the last couple of weeks, before the diplomacy over Ukraine started to crank up, and before Starmer set up his coalition of the willing and all of that, even then, apparently, he was devoting around half his time to foreign policy. Now, I suspect foreign policy is about the only thing he devotes his time to. And I think the reason he's doing that is because he cannot face what look like increasingly insurmountable problems closer to home. Now, last year, basically, the British economy flatlined. In January, it contracted, which came as a shock to many people. There was expectations that the economy would grow. Last in the autumn, if you remember, the government presented its budget. It increased spending considerably, mostly through it paying public sector workers. It increased taxes, and at the same time, it has committed itself to borrowing more. The government then gave various figures saying that in a couple of years' time, everything would balance out and we'd be on a sustainable trajectory. Well, that didn't last very long because over the last couple of months, the economy has contracted, as I said. Government receipts have been lower than expected. And the result has been that the fiscal headroom, as it's called, the available money that the government was raising has turned out to be less than they expected. So yesterday they've just had to go back to Parliament, announce further cuts. A couple of days ago, they announced cuts of £5 billion on spending for disabled people. Now they've announced a further £3 billion cuts on spending for people. And we're getting indications that they're going to increase taxes in the autumn. Now, the reason this is happening is because the economy, as I said, isn't growing. It's, if anything, contracting. The government is deeply in debt. It's 100% debt to GDP ratio. The UK is now around 100% of GDP. Britain runs a permanent deficit on its current account. So it's having to import capital from abroad. Foreign investors worry that Britain's public finances might become unsustainable. So whenever it looks as if the government might be about to run out of money, it has to either cut spending or increase taxes. That causes the economy to grow even more slowly. And then that forces the government a couple of months later, when it becomes clear that the money that it's raising is not going to be enough to go over the same process again. Cut spending, increase taxes. We are in Britain in a doom loop. That is what the economy, how the situation in the economy currently looks.
Do the people know this? Do the citizens of Britain understand this? Does Starmer understand this? Because you said he's interested in foreign policy, not so much interested in what's happening in the domestic affairs of the UK. I would even say that it's not even foreign policy. He's just concerned with Ukraine. That's it.
Yeah. Yes.
That's the only thing he's concerned about is Ukraine. Nothing else. Do the people understand? I mean, are they seeing this? Do they see him go to Paris every couple of weeks or having these summits in London about Ukraine? And are the people saying, what is this guy talking about with Ukraine all the time? What is he talking about? UK military in Ukraine that they don't have. To go to Ukraine to do what? Why is he talking about money? He's still talking about money to Zelensky, money that they don't have. I mean, what's the general vibe? What's the sentiment in the UK about all of this?
Well, one of the major problems, before I get to Starmer, I think it's important to point this out. I mean, there are lots of underlying problems in the British economy which have been building up over a very, very long time. And governments have been repeatedly making them worse. The decisions governments have been making, stretching all the way back, arguably to Blair's time, have ultimately undermined the foundations of the British economy more and more. Some would say going back even further to Thatcher's time and even beyond that. But anyway, let's not focus on the history. But these underlying problems have been made much worse over the last 2-3 years because of British government policy, specifically on the issue of Ukraine. Britain gives Ukraine direct grants. They're running at about £3 billion a year. Sometimes they've been more than that. The British government has been sending weapons to Ukraine on a huge scale. That has left the British armed forces in a very, very poor condition. One of the reasons they're having to spend more on defense is precisely because they need to re-equip the army because the army is so short of weapons now. They have created a state of international tensions. They've contributed very much to creating a state of tensions in, international tensions. There's fear of war with Russia. They're talking about having to increase defense spending. To address that, they never explain their own role in creating this crisis in international relations. And of course, the sanctions, which they so urgently, so insistently advocated on Russia, having a massive, effect on the British economy itself. They've resulted in very, very much higher energy costs. Prices for energy in Britain are amongst the highest in the world. And that's also had a cumulatively bad effect on the British economy. Moreover, there's strong reasons to think that energy prices are going to surge again in the autumn. We've been discussing various programs, how problems of gas supply, the amount of gas in the European reserves is now at critically low levels. Nobody is talking about this, but there is a real possibility that come the autumn, there will be shortages of gas. Gas will have to be bought at premium prices, liquefied natural gas. That's quite likely to be passed on in higher prices to UK consumers, which will depress the standard of living even further. So nobody wants to talk about this, but Ukraine is now a major reason why the government, from one budget to another, finds itself shorter and shorter of money, and why it's having to cut spending and or increases taxes in order to balance things out, so that foreign investors and foreign bondholders will continue to put money into Britain. Now, coming back to what people think, I think Starmer probably deep down has some understanding of this, but he doesn't want to face it. I think he is not prepared to change policy on Ukraine. As has been discussed many times now, he's basically a cutout. The political class, the people who run it, Starmer, for them, Ukraine, defeating Russia, getting Europe back into the EU. All of these things are far more important than what happens to the British economy.
Getting the UK back into the EU.
Yeah. Back into the EU, sorry. All of this is far more important for them than what happens in the short or medium or even long term to the British economy. So he will just continue doing what he wants to do. And at a psychological level, I think he finds it easier, much easier, to hold summit meetings with Macron, to talk about Putin and what a bad man he is, do those kind of things, than to confront the major increasing underlying problems of the British economy. As for the British people, they do understand this. The mood in the UK is very bad. People are very demoralized. I've been saying this now for months. You see this in the polling figures, where none of the political parties, Conservatives, Labour, are doing particularly well. So there is a widespread feeling that things in Britain are very bad and that there's no clear way forward. But there is still no real coming together of people, no real decision about what alternatives we should follow. And that also is contributing to the deepening malaise. There is a sense, instead, that whatever we do, whatever we try, matters are simply going to get, the situation is simply going to get worse. And that is very demoralizing. And it's causing people to hunker down, to try to get through day by day, hoping that some miracle will turn up in a year's time or 5 years' time or whenever, and then things will come back to normal. That's, I think, a summary of the mood here in the UK at the moment.
Final question on Farage.
Yeah.
It seems like Farage is sometimes it seems like he's going against the establishment. Other times it seems that he's folding into the establishment, yes. Complementing the establishment, the government, Starmer. Other times it looks like he's ready to lead reform to a victory. And then he says something which makes many people believe that perhaps he's leading reform to, or he's working against reform. I mean, I don't know. Farage seems like he's a bit lost, at least to me, as to what his position is on all of this. Is he establishment? Is he anti-establishment? Is he there to help reform? Is he there to dismantle reform? I haven't been quite able to put my finger on what Farage is looking to do. What are your thoughts?
He remains by far the most interesting politician in the UK at the moment. I mean, he is the politician who brought about Brexit, who changed politics in Britain. The great problem with Farage is that he's always been strongest in opposition. And he's never until now really imagined himself prime minister and worked out a program for government that he would take to the British people. He's now closer to achieving that goal than he has ever been. But he risks, and you can see this, the pressures are on him, falling into the trap that all insurrectionary leaders of political movements fall into, well, many of them do, which is that the closer he comes to power, the more he feels the inclination to compromise with the political class, because he thinks that if he does that, that's going to win over more centrist, more moderate voters who will then come to him and will give him the chance to lead. And he also thinks that if he does that, it will somehow make him more respectable and will make it easier if and when he does form a government, it'll make it easier for him to move forward and to establish a government that will be acceptable to the political class. You see this time and again. You see this with Meloni, for example, in Italy. That was exactly the trap, ultimately, that she fell into. So I think that is the danger with Farage. Remember, as I said, this is not someone who 2 or 3 years ago ever envisaged himself as prime minister. So this is why I think he's not catching fire. Because even though Reform is, by some calculations, not all, but by some calculations, the most popular party in Britain today. Others, by the way, put him ahead of the Conservatives, but still behind Labour. He's still only polling around, or between 20 and 25%, which is huge for an insurrectionary party in, or would have been huge for an insurrectionary party in a previous period in modern British history. But given the situation that we have today, it could arguably be said to be disappointing. This is, I think, the reason that he's flatlining, because he's not putting forward a convincing program telling people, look, this is all going terribly wrong. We've got to carry out much more radical changes to the way that Britain is run, because we are in this doom loop situation. So we have to change and adjust our foreign policy. We have to look at the way we run our domestic policy. We have to do all of these various things and put them all together, and then we can finally break out of this. I think people would be ready to listen to that. And I think if you put together a convincing program for reform, as he says, then change might happen. But he hasn't done that up to now. Now, a couple of days ago, he did have a meeting with Dominic Cummings, who was Boris Johnson's chief advisor, until, of course, Boris Johnson basically got rid of him. Now, Cummings is someone with lots of plans. I mean, he's got all kinds of ideas for change. Mostly, it must be said, more about governance and about how to change the structures in the center. Not all of which I agree with, by the way. But anyway, I mean, he's a man full of ideas. Maybe if it is indeed the case that Cummings and Farage will come together, that we'll start to see something a little bit more coherent coming from Reform and from Farage himself, and that will eventually start to work its way through and start to be appreciated by more people in Britain. But that's still something we have to see. And it's important to say that Farage and Cummings have a long history of very, very bad relations with each other. They're not friends.
All right. We will end the video there. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfin, and X. Go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch like what we are wearing in this video update. There is a 15% special as well on the Duran shop. Use the code SPRING15. The link is in the description box down below. Take care.